Hello and welcome to the Alexandra Wenman show. I'm so excited to have back on the show my dear friend Colm Holland. Colm
Hi, Alexandra.
obviously is the author of The Secret of the Alchemist. He's the founder of the Alchemy School of Transformation, and he has a new book out, and it's a very exciting topic. So, the true story of Jesus, Colm, tell us all about this book.
Yeah, so here it is, the true origins of Jesus. Thank you, Alexandra, by the way, for having me on here today. This is a great conversation starter, and it's a great way. The reason I love this book is it goes to the very heart of what mythology is. And being a Jungian student myself, mythology plays a huge part in that. So there's lots of ways we can talk about it. Just a quick background to the book. The book was self-published originally 10 years ago by a guy called Geoff Roberts. And Geoff sadly passed since then. And the book found me, if you like. It had a different title. It was called Jesus 888, after the numerology of Jesus. And I stumbled across it because a Danish friend of mine was going to be translating it into Danish. And that's how I discovered it. And he said, "Oh, you should really have a look at this book. It's great." So, and I did. And I approached the family and said, "Did this ever really get out there?" And they said, "No, not at all. No, just a few hundred copies." Geoff, really just wrote it because he thought it was an important book to write. And I said, "Well, do you mind if we republish it?" So we changed the name to The True Origins of Jesus. I edited it, and a friend of mine in the US wrote the foreword, and John Hunt Publishing decided to go ahead with it, which is great. And we're already number one. We're
Amazing.
already number one in hot new releases in Amazon UK for religious studies.
Well, that's fantastic, isn't it? I mean, it is such a hot topic. You've got
Yeah,
so much, there's been so much kind of revelation around the story of Jesus and Magdalene and the Gnostics and the true origins of Christianity. So, can you tell us a little bit of the juiciness of this book? Like, what sets this book apart to, say, other books that are attempting to reveal the true kind of origins
sure.
of Jesus?
So, yeah, Geoff wasn't a Christian, the author. He was an investigative journalist for a Manchester newspaper most of his life. He was raised in a Christian school, Church of England school, I think, in England, and he just felt he started to read theological works questioning the literacy of the Bible, particularly the New Testament, the historical factualness of the Bible, and he realized that nobody had ever really written what he called a Reader's Digest sort of version of all of this. And it's extensive, his work. It's not a long book, but the number of topics that he covers here in the introduction, as you can see here, he
Great
covers.
contents. I looked at the contents. I was like, oh, this is juicy.
I mean, he's covering topics that normally are only ever touched on by theologians, and people don't read theology.
Mm.
In fact, there's lots and lots of people who claim to belong to the church who don't even read the Bible.
Mm.
So, because if you did read the Bible, seriously read the Bible, and started to compare this book and that book and another book, you'd get into trouble.
Your brain would do flip-flops because it's so contradictory, most of it, isn't it?
Did he go to Egypt? I thought you said Jesus went to Egypt. But this guy said he didn't go to Egypt. He went back to Nazareth, and then somebody else, and then Herod killed all the children. But then the other one said no, he never even mentioned that. And there's only three wise men in one of them. So did they actually? Who were these three wise? Did they even exist? So in the end, you actually, an intelligent, inquiring 21st century mind has to say, if it's not really factual, historical, and my intellect won't let me buy into that. And what is the purpose of the New Testament? What is the purpose? Because the Orthodox Church, 90% of the Orthodox Church, and the influence that it has on Western society in the US and the Commonwealth and Africa, in particular, huge parts of India, Europe, of course. I mean, I don't know what proportion of the world has come under Christian church influence, either in politics or in religion, but at the core of that, there is this assumption that Jesus actually existed.
Mm.
And in the past, what theologians have actually done is they said, well, people weren't that good at keeping history back 2,000 years ago. So there was a guy called Jesus, and he was a lovely guy, and you've seen him in the movies. He wore all these cloning long blonde hair, and he did lots of great things. He healed people. He came from a lowly origin, and he's just been misrepresented, by people who have sort of spiritual agendas when they were writing the book. Don't take it too seriously.
You
but
also have a lot of people from a spiritual standpoint who've had visitation from
Wow.
Yeah, me too, right? So we factor in that he, as an individual, we assume that he's an individual because we have, what we think is evidence. But sorry, carry on, Colm. I had to just throw
No, that's a good point. I mean, the whole point of this is that the way that theologians have dealt with this in over the centuries in many different ways is to say that in the end of the day, the thing that really binds Christianity together, that stops us from arguing about this belief and that belief, and what unites us the most is there really was a Jesus. And we gather around this central figure, Jesus. What Geoff did was saying, well, that's fine, and it's well-meaning, but actually I've done he did a lot, and so has a lot of academic work been done over the centuries to try and find this historical Jesus. And he says right at the opening of his book, he quotes one of the top theologians who studied this. I've got it highlighted here, a guy called Earl Doherty. And he said, before the Gospels were adopted as history, which was probably within 500, 600 years of the original writings, there is no record existing at all that Jesus was ever in the city of Jerusalem or anywhere else on earth, for that matter. And this wasn't a time when people weren't keeping historical records. People were keeping. The Egyptians kept amazing historical records. The Greeks had scribes and lawyers, and I mean, people. You can pick up books of details of people's divorces from 200 years before Christ, before Common Era even. More scrolls have been found. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for example. Huge records of people's religious faith and so on, the Gnostics in particular. And wherever you go in all of this stuff, never once anywhere is there a record of this person, Jesus.
This is a massive bombshell, isn't it? Like for Christians, for Catholics, for people who, the saviour is the kind of saving grace of everything. This is quite revelatory. We are in the time of the revelations, I guess, aren't we?
We are. And he quotes Paul Gimbes, of course, the words that you read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so, from the musical. And so is that the end then? That's the question. Now, how nuanced, how spiritual then is our relationship to Jesus? How dependent in our thinking and understanding of Christianity in particular, and the teachings of Christ, which are amazing. Nobody would contradict them. Other religions adopt them as well and don't contradict them at all, because guess what? They've got them as well. And they crop up on, particularly Buddhism. And Buddhism is one of the chaps. In fact, it was my study of Buddhism in the New Testament, Buddhist sayings, Buddhist thinking, Buddhist spirituality, turn the other cheek, do good to those who hurt you, love your enemies, the Beatitudes, both versions of the Beatitudes, blessed are the weak, blessed are the poor, blessed are those who are humble of spirit, blessed, and so on. Both versions of the Beatitudes and all of that can all be traced back to Buddhism in some way. There are equivalent sentiments, and there are even episodes and specific milestones in the life, the older stories of the life of Buddha, that completely mirror the life of Christ. Even the number of disciples, even, you know, all you have to read it. It's all there. So what does the psyche do? So from our own personal spiritual point of view, then we've got several choices when it comes to the New Testament and Christianity and Jesus. So on the one extreme, you can do what Billy Graham did. Those of you who have been around long enough to remember who Billy Graham was, who was a big deal in England in the 1950s. He came over and thousands and thousands of people converted to Christianity, including the Queen, the late Queen, by the way. She was a close friend of Dr. Billy Graham. When Billy Graham, who was raised in a Southern Baptist, deeply Bible-based, the Bible is the truth, you can't question it in any way, shape or form. When he went to theological college, Baptist Bible Training College, and he started to read the theology and so on, he had a massive crisis of faith, where he personally, you know, he realized that this can't be taken literally. It doesn't even add up with itself. It contradicts itself all the time. So what's factual and what's not, it's too hard to work it out. And he made a decision that if believing the Bible literally worked, and it had a power to transform people's lives, belief in it could help you transform your life, then I'll teach it. So he made a conscious decision to ignore his intellect and to ignore what the standard that it, you know, if it's not factually true, then it's meaningless. He said, it's not factually true, but it's not meaningless either. There is power in the story. Now, effectively, what he was doing cleverly, I mean, you've got to take your hat off to him. It was a really, really clever decision. He decided that the psyche, the way that the human spirituality works within the mind and the heart and the soul, is that by believing in something, whether it's story or whether it's fact or whatever, has power. It has the ability to transform and to, you know, move people's lives forward, especially if it's based in love.
Absolutely.
And that's the saving factor of the New Testament, is that the central message of Jesus, whether he walked the seas on the Sea of Galilee or whether he didn't, whether he's a construction of a myth, of a story, or whether he was a factual man, the message is, you know, love one another. This is my only command. If you forget everything else, you can just remember this. Can you just remember this one thing? You know, love one another as I have loved you. And that sums up all the laws of the Old Testament, all the commandments.
The only sentence you need, really, isn't it?
That's what it's it.
That's it.
And the power lies in that. So the problem that I think we've got, do we have a problem? Yeah, I think there is a problem. Let's own up, there is a problem. I think the problem, and this is why Geoff pursued this book, is that in order for certain religious groups, mentioning no names, because it's right across the spectrum, to contain people, to keep the money coming in, to control people, to apply moral behavior, to create allegiance, to do whatever, that love one another as I have loved you gets quietly swept under the carpet, and it's replaced with this rule and that rule and that rule. So if you're gay or lesbian, you've got a problem. If your marriage falls apart, you've got a problem. If you are a victim of abuse, you've got a problem, because it's really hard in those institutionalized forms of Christianity to find a place and to be accepted and to know that you're wanted and so.
And yet the other thing that really comes through a lot of those teachings and the distortion of it is that the carrying of guilt, and also the belief that you have to suffer to be spiritual. So you need poverty and chastity, and you've got to not let yourself have any pleasure in life, all of those kinds of self-flagellation programs that have come through, which completely to me seems like the antithesis of love.
Spoken like a good Catholic.
I know, right? A very lapsed Catholic.
So yeah, that's one end of the, so I always see things in spectrums like you do, and there's always extremes, and yeah, that is one extreme, and it's extremely popular right up until I mean, even now today there are within the Catholic Church, there are cults within the Catholic, I'm not going to name any names, there are cults who still advocate stuff like that, the secret handshake clubs and so on. And Dan Brown, of course, in the Da Vinci Code made a lot of money out of trying to expose that. And then on the other extreme,
and actually I want to really give a nod to some of the original researchers of that information. There was Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince had a fantastic book called The Templar Revelation, which they obviously did the academic research behind a lot of that stuff that came out in those films, among other authors as well. And I just want to give credit where credit is due. But it's fascinating topics, and I think, but I do think the one thing about the Da Vinci Code is it did start to bring some of this right out into the mainstream and into the masses, and get the wheels of our brains kind of churning and questioning, and what's really going on here? What is this real story?
Sure. So one of the things I think Geoff succeeds, and I was actually thinking I might write a book like this years ago, and decided I just didn't have a long enough life to do it. So when I discovered it, I was over the moon that somebody had done a really good job, and as editor of the book, I just sort of tidied it up, cleaned up some of the references so you could go and find the original academic work and so on. He covers not just the Gospels themselves and how they contradict each other. He does look at a group called the Gnostics. And if you've not read any of this stuff, anybody listening here, you can save yourself, hours and years of your life by just reading
that book.
The one book, because
thanks, Geoff, for doing all that research.
I know.
For us.
Years of it, apparently, before the Google as
what
well.
What an incredible guy to go and devote so much time and energy and to find those resources and pull it all together.
He had a burning desire. Is what his wife told me. Just burning desire was for the truth. So it wasn't that he wanted to debunk the Bible and destroy Christianity. Far from it. He says that in his introduction and in his conclusion. He said, I think there's probably something even more important that we're missing. If we're so glued in and so focused in on it all having to be factually true, and if it's not factually true, then it's irrelevant. He said the people who actually started this, the Gnostics in particular, but also those that drew upon Egyptian mythology and those that were surrounded in Greek mythology of the time, and the mystery religions, those of you who he talks about who they are as well, and if you've got time, definitely recommend exploring that. But all of these different sources came together and conglomerated, if you like, into one particular story. And he would say, it's not called the greatest story ever told for no reason. It is a really, really great story. And it's great because it actually does have a power within it, within the story. There it is, but it's not what we think it is. We think the power lies in the historical truth.
I love when I was looking at the contents, when I was in Egypt back in 2012, which is when he originally published this book, right?
Yeah, it was.
So I was in Egypt in 2012, and I was doing a lot of channeling and getting a lot of what we call downloads, just dumpings of insights and information. And I'm very enamored with the story of Akhenaten, and I think he was a very early version of Yeshua, and he was then called the heretic king. And I believe he was murdered, actually, and I believe Tutankhamun was murdered. And I think that was an attempt for the priest to take control. It's the same story over and over again. But when I was in Egypt, I was getting all these kind of downloads, visitations from Akhenaten, and my friend Lorraine Flaherty as well, who was getting. We often have shared vision. and we won't tell each other until after we've had information, and then we talk about it afterwards. We go into a space and we will feel into the energy of the space, and then we get given this information. But I was standing in the Valley of the Kings, and I had this incredible visitation from Akhenaten, and he kind of showed me the path of the soul, and he pulled me right back into the soul's origins and went right back into the void and the birth of the soul, and the light that exists within every single one of us being like this brilliant explosion that looked like a huge sun. And he said to me, not sun, S-O-N, of God, sun, S-U-N, of God. And every single person is that and carries that and has the potential to activate that within themselves. That is the true Christ light. So I loved when you said to me before we even started talking, I know, and in the contents he's written it, and that was
Chapter
2012.
12.
Isn't that unbelievable? So there's a piece of evidence definitely for me that what I was shown then, that is absolutely huge. And I love this because you and I always have these epiphanies, Colm. It always kind of drops in. But so we were talking before we started the interview about, if Yeshua or Jesus or the man we know as Christ, if he